Good morning to you. The Prime Minister has made one big, solemn promise to the British people that he'd get us out of the European Union. No ifs, no buts, do or die by October the 31st. That's on Thursday. He's not going to do it, is he? Meanwhile, month in, month out, the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn has had one single relentless message: give Britain a general election as soon as possible, but not apparently just yet. It's all very frustrating, except, hold on, folks, news in this morning. The Scottish National Party and the Liberal Democrats have today unveiled a fresh, simple plan for an election before Christmas. Is the Brexit dam about to break? Well, our task this morning is to find out. So I'm joined by the Lib Dem leader, Jo Swinson, whose name is on the new election plan. But the crucial next question is whether the Conservatives will also back it. I'm joined by the Tory chairman tasked with planning that election, James Cleverly. And then there's the big question of Labour. The Shadow Home Secretary, Diane Abbott, is here to reveal their thinking. And, oh yes, a bit of relief from politics. The singer-songwriter James Blunt's new album's just been released this weekend, and he is here to play us out.
Without your arms around me, without you on my skin, without you on my body, I'm sorry, I'm sorry.
In our paper review this morning, I'm joined by another party leader, Sian Berry, the co-leader of the Greens, by Amanda Platell of the Daily Mail, and by Mujtaba Rahman, formerly of the Treasury and the European Commission, now of the Eurasia Group, a political consultancy firm. All of that coming up soon, but first, the news with Ben Thompson.
Andrew, thank you. Good morning. The Liberal Democrats and the SNP say they'll work together to push for an election on the 9th of December if the EU grants a 3-month extension to the Brexit deadline. The parties have written to European Council President Donald Tusk to ask for the extension. In the letter, they say they don't support the Prime Minister's deal or his call for a poll on December the 12th. It comes ahead of another vote on an election in Parliament tomorrow. President Trump will make a major statement later following reports of a US Special Forces operation against a leader of the so-called Islamic State group. US media is reporting that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi has been killed, but there's been no official confirmation. The president tweeted that something very big had happened, but gave no further detail. Church services have been held by families in Vietnam who fear their relatives are among the 39 people found dead in a lorry container in Essex. It's thought that the majority of the victims were Vietnamese citizens, and police say they're now working to identify them all. A lorry driver from Northern Ireland will appear in court tomorrow, charged with manslaughter. There have been more clashes between police and protesters in Barcelona following the jailing of 9 Catalan separatist leaders. Some of the 350,000 demonstrators threw bottles and fireworks at police, who responded with tear gas and rubber bullets. 9 separatist politicians and activists were jailed earlier this month by Spain's Supreme Court. And the semi-final of the Rugby World Cup between Wales and South Africa is kicking off in the Japanese city of Yokohama, with a place in next week's final against England up for grabs. England pulled off one of their best ever performances to beat New Zealand by 19 points to 7 yesterday. That's all the news from me for now. The next on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. Andrew, back to you.
Many thanks, Ben. Front pages and a shout-out for the Observer newspaper this morning. They've got the story about this tragic migrant death, saying Britain is going to be cut out of the migrant policing unit of the EU as a result of leaving the EU. But note this, there's their first edition. No Brexit until next year, Johnson warns. They are the only papers who have got the big political story this morning of the Lib Dems and the SNP changing the game. Lib Dems offer Johnson route to December elections, says the later editions, and they've got much more of that inside. Perhaps if I'd been them, I'd have made that the splash, but that's a picky point. They're the only paper to have got that story. The Mail on Sunday, it's the luck of the draw. They've talked to somebody involved in the ghastly story of the lorry migrants. The Sunday Express, again, slightly behind the curve, guys. Stop holding Britain hostage, says Boris Johnson. That may be out of date. The Sunday Times has got pictures of England in triumph at the rugby in Japan there. And they've been talking to Archbishop Welby, who's in Africa, and he's accusing Boris Johnson of pouring petrol on a divided Britain. They've got various other stories there, but that's the most important one. And rows inside the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn's circle, about whether or not to have an early election. And then finally, the Sunday Telegraph. They've done a story about John Bercow and bullying allegations as their main story, but perhaps more interesting, they've done a story about whether 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds will be able to vote at the next election. There are opposition moves to ensure that happens, but their story is that there isn't time for that to happen, to change the electoral register for a winter election in which 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds would actually be able to vote. So a lot to talk about. Mujtaba, let's start with you. You've got the Sunday Times there, and as ever, Tim Shipman has given us a big, long read, slightly out of date, but what does it tell us?
So it's a very good scene setter that talks about the Tory strategy to try and facilitate an election prior to the news breaking overnight that the Lib Dems and SNP now may table a motion for an early election this week. And interestingly, it talks about a strategy whereby the government was going to continuously table motions under the Fixed-Term Parliament Act in an attempt to essentially shame Labour into ultimately relenting and conceding an election.
Poking them in the chest day after day, effectively.
And to force them to really own their reason to not go to the polls. And that reason is essentially that they're concerned about the cliff edge on the 31st of January or indeed at the end of the transitional period in December 2020.
As I understand it, Sian, the effect of this new measure by the Lib Dems and the SNP is to ensure that so-called cliff edge doesn't happen until the end of January and that therefore there is plenty of time for an election first. Were you talked to about this? Were you part of those negotiations, and what's the Green Party's view?
Yes, I mean, obviously, whether or not we get an election does very much depend upon how Labour votes in Parliament. And I think this is some electioneering already by the Lib Dems and the SNP. We were asked to sign up to this, and we did ask that in terms of sorting out Brexit, we've been absolutely consistent that a people's vote, a further referendum, is the way to get clarity on that issue, and that a general election, given all the uncertainties which are all over the papers about who might fight in which way and who might win, a general election was not going to be the way to do that with clarity. So we did ask as Greens that a people's vote, a democratic event was included, but maybe a general election, maybe a people's vote, depending. And that wasn't agreed to, so we are not signed up to this letter. That said, we are ready for a general election. All the parties have been getting ready for many months now for a general election, and we're more than ready to win some more Green MPs. But I think in terms of sorting out Brexit, 1 million people did not march last weekend crying out for a general election. They wanted a people's vote. They wanted a clear final say, and an election won't do that.
So you're sticking with that. Amanda, like me, a seasoned observer of the scene.
Less than seasoned.
Are we heading for a general election before Christmas?
I think it's much more likely this morning, after we heard that news. I mean, it was quite jaw-dropping, especially you just thought there was this pattern Boris was going to go in, as you were saying, you know, poke him. I wouldn't have said in the chest, I would have said in the eye. Poke Corbyn and try and shame him to do an election. And now he doesn't have to do it. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. But when you say
from the Conservatives' point of view, they are given something they've asked for all the way along. It's very hard for the Tories not to vote for this, I'd have thought.
Very difficult indeed.
Yeah.
But the problem is it does, because this story's been quite rushed into the paper and we're only hearing the narrative this morning, it's not clear. It says that they would insist that the no deal was taken off the table. Now, that may be a stumbling block for a lot of the Tories. But, you know, when you say that they're already, read it, constant narrative now at the moment is that they're completely split on how to run this election themselves. You know, you've got their new strategy advisor who's fighting over whether or not they fight every seat or whether they do targeted seats. John McDonnell seems to be, you know, switching one way and another. And the incredible impression you get is that Jeremy Corbyn is frightened of having an election because he's frightened that he will lose.
Now, for those of us who are seasons, not Amanda Platell, but Andrew Marr, certainly, this all calls to mind 1979, when the SNP famously helped to vote down James Callaghan's Labour government and usher in an election which brought Margaret Thatcher to power. And Callaghan said to them, I think he was the first to use the phrase in this context, this is like turkeys, voting for Christmas. And the SNP was certainly hammered in that election. This is very, very different. The SNP think they're going to take almost all the Scottish seats. They're very, very confident
much
indeed.
stronger, aren't they?
Totally different. But the Turkey's voting for Christmas line appears on Andrew Rawnsley's column in The Observer.
Correct. So there is an assumption that a pre-Brexit, pre-Christmas election will be excellent for the Tories because they can run on a People versus Parliament platform, and there's a potential coalition of votes in the south because Boris Johnson is running on a deal platform, as well as appealing to Labour leavers in the north and the Midlands. And the interesting piece about the interesting argument that Rawnsley makes in The Observer is that you cannot at all take that for granted. It's winter, it will be cold. North of the border, of course, in Scotland, the Tories are going to fare very badly. And of course, at winter, there will be the NHS pressure there. Potential bad headlines for the government that could potentially undermine their standing.
Take nothing for granted. But before this broke, we were all focused on President Macron of France, who seemed to be, as it were, helping out Boris Johnson by pushing for an earlier deadline in November, which would have given the Commons the confrontation of either go for no deal, accept no deal, or vote for Boris Johnson's withdrawal agreement bill. That is no longer quite so relevant, and presumably after this, which is, I think, a one-line bill coming in on Tuesday, I think, President Macron will withdraw his demand for an earlier deadline.
I suspect so. So EU ambassadors will meet on Monday or Tuesday, and I think there was a risk of a 15th of November extension. But now, again, with the breaking news overnight, I suspect Macron will have a face-saving way of standing down, and the extension will be agreed to the 31st of January.
Was he going to lose that confrontation in Brussels, do you think?
I think Berlin and Paris had their heads locked on this question, so I don't think Macron was going to veto the extension, but I do think he was going to force a compromise on a much shorter time frame. I think he feels very strongly that a longer extension would not incentivise MPs to move forward on this question. So I think a compromise over a shorter date was likely.
Meanwhile, we're moving towards this election. Sian, one of the stories in the papers today, I think it's on the front page of the Sunday Telegraph here, is about, as I said, the 16 and 17-year-olds getting the vote. A lot of people on the left of politics want this to happen and are pushing for it. We're going to amend various measures. But it's a complicated thing. You have to change the entire electoral register to get them on. And their stories, there's no time for that.
In a rushed general election, I think that is probably true. But it is something we've been calling for some years in the Green Party. And elsewhere in the papers, we've also got comments about, how much young people around the world are rising up and protesting, and how influential Greta Thunberg has been. Saying that they shouldn't be able to vote is something that I think is out of date now, and people are rapidly changing their views. The speed with which I think people have realised that 16-year-olds now are people who should have a stake in society.
You are on
is
the...
something.
I think there's a very mixed view about that. You know that. There's a lot of people think that if you're not a stakeholder, if you're not old enough, student politics don't qualify you for taking part in the general election.
But the fact that climate change is the issue that's brought that to bear, the fact that the future of these people is being decided by people other than them, that's what's driving people out into the streets. And I think just giving them a vote would be absolutely the best way to do that.
And you are pursuing the parliamentary road ahead. At the moment, all the headlines have been about Extinction Rebellion's approach to this. Has that changed the overall political atmosphere for the Green Party in a good way?
Certainly. I mean, we've come off this year two of our best ever elections, in the local elections and the EU elections. We more than doubled our representation. I think for us not to have the biggest general election that we've ever had would be very strange. Certainly, I think there's really interesting in the Labour story about their tactics, the row about whether or not to target, because I think we've always targeted our resources, and I think all the opposition parties, if we're going to stop a Tory majority, if we're going to stop us crashing out of the EU, we need to be getting a bit more organised and a bit more targeted about what we do. Now,
you were talking about the Lib Dems just now, criticising them. They're going for revoke rather than for a people's vote, so-called people's vote, another referendum. But also there's been a lot of talk about pro-Remain parties, of which you are both pro-Remain parties, getting together and doing deals so that you're putting up one candidate in crucial seats that you could win. And there were talks over the summer and then the beginning of the autumn. How have those got on? Have you got a list of target seats yet?
We're not. We're still talking to each other. There isn't any resolution there as yet. But I think, whatever way you do it, whether or not it's standing one candidate, which is a very, that's the most extreme way of doing it. But at least targeting your resources so that you're focused on some seats each. At least being honest with each other about how you're doing that. There are different ways to cooperate, and I think particularly Labour ought to be talking to us more. Certainly, we've seen some really good cooperation within Parliament. I think seeing off the previous call for a general election was something that was done very, very well between the opposition parties, and they're not talking enough, in my opinion.
All right. Mujtaba, let's talk about another part of the UK we haven't mentioned so far this morning, which is Northern Ireland, because there's an interesting story there that the Northern Irish view of all of this is on the move. Yes,
I mean, there's a poll that's been done, and a majority of voters would prefer Remain to Boris Johnson's deal. And that also then relates to another story regarding the DUP in the Sunday Telegraph. And I mean, it's interesting that the DUP is really stuck. Theresa May's agreement, which was a de facto customs union, would have resulted in a soft regulatory border in the Irish Sea. Boris Johnson's deal puts both a customs and a regulatory border in the Irish Sea. And of course, the DUP are extremely unhappy about that. Yeah. But they have little or no leverage now that Boris was able to get a majority through on second reading. Amanda, I suspect you want to talk most about the rugby, but there's also the Justin Welby story on the front page of the Sunday Times. So I'm going to let you choose what you want to talk about next.
OK, I can do them really quickly. Justin Welby, shut up and stop attacking the Tories all the time. It's getting a bit boring and a bit biased. But the rugby, wasn't this fantastic yesterday? I just loved it. My favourite thing was seeing the beginning, when you see the New Zealanders who were supposed to win, and they're doing their haka, and then England lined up in this exquisite white V sign. And it was glared at them. And glared at. No, they smirked. They didn't glare. They just sort of went, yeah, like, try. And I thought, and the one that I absolutely adore, I think he's become the poster boy for. The reason I'm putting my glasses on, it's not to get a look at his torso more clearly.
You say that, man. You say that.
He's brilliant. This is Itoje, and he's just like this consummate player. He's a great guy. He's a feminist. He's just everything you could possibly want. And he's a poet.
He's a poet. And he's a feminist. He's woke. He's
He's not woke. He's tough. He's a rugby player. Rugby players aren't woke. And come on. And this is the end of his, which I hope will be what will happen in the game next Saturday when we play. England plays. There comes a time when the time must be taken.
And on that thrilling note, to all of my reviewers, woke and still fast asleep, thanks very much indeed. And so to the weather, wild warnings of torrential rain, flooding, heavy storms and rapidly dropping temperatures. But are they reliable? Over to Louise Lear in the Weather Centre. Louise.
Oh, Andrew, you can always rely on the BBC Weather Centre for the information, I can tell you. I'm pleased to say it's much better as well, much quieter the weather after the last couple of days after this month. Just look at Shropshire. Not a cloud in the sky. Beautiful. Chilly, yes, but the reason for this quieter story is high pressure building in from the Atlantic. This weather front here just enhancing more showers across Scotland, accompanied by freshening northerly winds. So they've been a bit of a nuisance through the night. They'll continue to be a nuisance for the remainder of the day. One or two drifting down into southwest Scotland and Northern Ireland, but with clearer skies elsewhere. It's going to be a beautiful, sparkling Sunday afternoon for many. Get out and enjoy it if you can. It will be on the chilly side. 8 to 13 degrees the high, and it really does look as though this trend is set to continue. So through the night, little change. Clear skies continue, winds falling lighter, fewer showers in the far north, and that can only mean one thing at this time of year. Those temperatures are expected to fall away widely into low single figures, just below in sheltered rural parts. It does mean another beautiful but frosty start to Monday. The next few days, drier and sunnier, but colder. There you go, Andrew.
I'll settle for that. Let's return now to that central question about a pre-Christmas general election. Jo Swinson, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, is with me. Jo Swinson, what is the intention of your short bill, which is coming in, I think, on Tuesday?
Well, this bill is very straightforward. It would set the date for the next election on the 9th of December, but crucially, it would be conditional on there being an extension to Article 50, which would mean no deal was taken off the table. One of the big concerns many people have had about going into a general election has been the fear that we would crash out of the EU without a deal, either during that election or in the immediate aftermath. And our bill removes that threat.
So for all those people who don't trust Boris Johnson not to get us out without a deal, the bill sorts that, but it also gives Boris Johnson what he wants, which is an early general election.
Well, we think we need to resolve this impasse. It's also important that we send a message to the EU, because they have not yet granted the extension past Thursday the 31st of October. We thought they might have done on Friday. They have said they're going to wait to see what happens on Monday. And it's important that they recognise that Parliament is able to act. Last time they said, don't waste the time. Boris Johnson has taken time wasting to a new level, proroguing Parliament, not trying to get a deal.
Okay.
We need to resolve it. I think the best way to do that would be a people's vote, but in the absence of proper Labour numbers to do that, a general election would be the other way.
And do you think this is going to change President Macron's mind? Because he was talking about a much earlier extension.
Well, I think it gives some certainty that there is a majority in Parliament to move on and put this back to the public, because that is what needs to happen. We have a bad Brexit bill, Brexit deal that Boris Johnson has negotiated, and that isn't something that's going to be good for our country, and we need to be able to let people have their say.
So you've done this with the SNP, but there's still a big question of numbers. Can I ask, have you spoken to Boris Johnson about this?
I haven't spoken to Boris Johnson, but I think the challenge is absolutely on him, because if he is serious about wanting an election, and if he's genuine that it's about having an election before Christmas, then he can back this bill. Because the other problem with his plan is that it leaves the ability to set the date of the election down to the Prime Minister. Now, he says the 12th of December, but, I mean, this is a man that's prepared to say anything. He doesn't do what he says. The advantage of this bill is it enshrines the date in the law, and we know that ultimately, when push comes to shove, he has been forced to obey the law, whether that was on recalling Parliament or whether that was on sending that letter to request the extension.
The Fixed Term Parliament Act, as I understand it, should give Parliament some certainty about election dates. Prime Ministers can't dissolve Parliament for an election and then just keep putting it off until we crash out. But nonetheless, I see the argument behind that. What about Jeremy Corbyn? Because he's also part of the numbers game, of course, and his position is still unknown. Have you been talking to him? Have you been talking to the Labour Party about getting their support for your motion?
Well, yes, we've made sure we sent our proposals over to the Labour Party, so it will be good to see whether they support this, because again, Jeremy Corbyn has said quite reasonably that he didn't want to support an election while there was the threat of no deal, crashing out without a deal, and of course this removes that threat, so they should be able to support this proposal.
Somebody, and I can't remember who it was tweeting overnight, I'm beginning to wonder whether the Lib Dems have a bit of a death wish. And the reason they're saying that is we're now heading for an election, we assume, if this goes through on Tuesday, and you're going to be facing two parties, one which has, with Boris Johnson, whatever you think of Boris Johnson, he is a formidable campaigner with a lot of money and a lot of heft behind him and a single clear message about Brexit on the one hand, and on the other hand you've got Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, second largest party, or possibly the largest party in Europe, 500,000 people knocking on doors. He's also a very, very good campaigner, and you're going to see really two huge machines. Traditionally, I'm afraid the Lib Dems have got rather squashed between them. Why is that not going to happen this time?
Well, things are very different now. We've got two men who are stuck in different versions of the past, and we are offering a genuinely brighter future where we stay in the EU and we're able to get on with tackling the issues, whether it's the climate emergency or how we move our country forward. I relish the chance to take on both Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn, because neither one of them is fit to lead our country. That's why I'm standing as a candidate to be Prime Minister. And
you use that phrase again, I'm going to be Prime Minister, but the truth of the matter is that is an absolutely awesome mountain to climb for the Liberal Democrats. To get, Chuka Umunna talked about getting 200 seats. To get 200 seats, you'd have to win seats like Warrington North, a very famous Cheshire seat. Roy Jenkins failed to take it for the SDP a long time ago. You came not second, not third, but fourth behind UKIP with just 2-point-something% of the vote last time. The chances of you taking Warrington North from the Labour Party, a safe Labour seat, are almost nil.
Well, I'm not going to get into the specifics of whether that seat needs to be on the path to victory, but what is the case is that the Liberal Democrats beat both the Conservatives and the Labour Party in the European elections, the first time that had happened for 100 years. We have had tens of thousands of people joining our party. We have been attracting MPs from both the Conservatives and the Labour Party. And the politics is different now.
I know that,
different
but
now.
the European elections are very different. For a general election, you have to take seats like Witney, David Cameron's old seat, which got a huge majority overturned. 25,000 Tory majority in Witney, in Oxfordshire.
I mean, if you look at what we did at the by-election, actually, we ran the Conservatives pretty close. So there are seats that we have never won before that are absolutely in contention now. You mentioned the machines of the other parties. We are raising more money than we have ever raised before. We have got more members than we ever have before. And it's because people are appalled at Boris Johnson and the way he is leading our country into disaster. They are appalled by the lack of leadership from Jeremy Corbyn, and they see that there is a genuine alternative under my leadership of the Lib Dems. That's why they're joining us.
One thing that Jeremy Corbyn has perhaps noticed is that the Remain side of the argument is divided between those who want another referendum, the people's vote side, and those who simply want to revoke. You have put your money very heavily on revoke, which sounds to me as if you're saying to people at the next general election, if you want to sort this out with another big democratic moment, another referendum, don't vote for us. We'll revoke. We'll pull the plug completely.
The Liberal Democrats believe that our best future is within the European Union, and so we are the party that is the biggest and strongest party of Remain. We want to stop Brexit. We can't be clearer about that. And so if we win a Liberal Democrat majority, of course we will revoke Article 50. That doesn't mean that we will stop campaigning for a people's vote in circumstances where we don't win a majority, because that may then be the route to do it. We are about stopping Brexit.
Let's just come back to your bill coming in on Tuesday. Is that amendable? Because I guess some Conservatives will think it could be amended to put in lowering the voting age to 16 or retaining membership of the Customs Union or even for another referendum. Can it be amended? Will you accept amendments?
I mean, any bill in Parliament could be amended, but the intention is very much that this is a simple bill that can be passed through Parliament quickly.
So you won't be supporting amendments?
Of course, I would love to see votes at 16 as we have in Scotland for most elections. I've campaigned on it for many years, but I recognise that the time pressures that we are under right now don't give us that luxury, because the 31st of January isn't that far away, and so we cannot
no
guarantee.
Amendments, please.
I think we need to pass this as it is drafted. We cannot assume that we will always keep getting extensions to Article 50. We do need to resolve this issue. I've worked hard in Parliament to try to secure a majority for a people's vote. It hasn't been forthcoming. Even this week, we tabled an amendment. We have tabled amendments for a people's vote 17 times, and Labour have not backed them in sufficient numbers. In contrast, 19 Labour MPs voted for Boris Johnson's deal.
Jo Swinson, you mentioned Scotland just now. Apart from winning new seats, you have to defend your own seats. You've got a 5,000 majority. You've been talking to the SNP, but you know you are a key target for the SNP. Now that you're leader of the Liberal Democrats across the UK, are you going to switch seats to ensure that you get back next time? You're not going to scuffle?
Absolutely not. I represent Eastern Bartonshire. It's the place where I grew up. It's my home seat. I won it in 2005. I won it back again in 2017 from the SNP. And I will never be complacent, but I am confident that I will win that seat again if the good people of Eastern Bartonshire want me to continue being their MP as well as being leader of the Liberal Democrats.
But if Nicola Sturgeon's formidable machine washes over the good people of Eastern Bartonshire and you lose, do you then step down as Lib Dem leader?
I mean, this is a hypothetical and a hypothetical. Let's bear in mind that the candidate that I beat at the last election has decided that this is not a seat that he plans to fight me again in, and he's headed off to a different seat. Right. So, yeah, I'm standing in my seat, and I'm confident that people in Eastern Bartonshire will choose me to continue as their MP.
You very vividly described the Prime Minister and the leader of the Labour Party as two men stuck in the past just now. There was a very controversial tweet that you put up recently. Let's just look at it. We haven't got it, I beg your pardon. You talked about 6 white men stuck in a room. That suggested to a lot of people as if you were underestimating the number of British black and Asian voters who voted for Brexit, and also the number of women who voted for Brexit. It sounded like you're putting them down.
No, not at all. My point was about who is in the room when the decisions are being made. white men are an important part of our society. They make up about 42% of our society. But to say that you have 6 people in a room making a crucial decision like that, and they are all from that 40% of society, that's not the best way to get good decision-making. Diversity, we all know, is good for better decision-making.
I guess I'm wondering why their colour and gender matters, because Jeremy Corbyn is in that position because huge numbers of black and Asian Britain, many of them women, voted for him and wanted him to be there. He's representing them. It's a representative democracy.
Representation matters. And it matters that we don't just have people standing up for those that voted for him, but that the voices of women, of people of colour, of disabled people, of people who have different sexual orientations are all within our House of Commons, and that is what a modern Britain looks like. And I want to see us having the people who are making those decisions, not just one group doing it on behalf of those other people, but that those are truly drawn from the rich diversity of our country. And I don't think that should be controversial, frankly.
Can you be a feminist and vote for Brexit?
Of course you can.
So you're not saying that the fact that they were men and white matters that much?
Well, it matters.
I mean, they are who they are. They've been chosen by people of all colours and genders.
Well, I mean, Dominic Cummings and Seamus Milne have not been
so
chosen by any democratic process. And, of course, people can be feminists and have all different political views. Right. And so I'm not making the point that you're suggesting I am, but it is important that the people in the room making the decisions are truly drawn from the public at large.
One very quick last question. Are we going to have a general election before Christmas?
Well, I think that is very possible, and the answer to that depends on whether the Prime Minister is genuine, that he wants to do it in a way that gives the confidence we can have it without a no-deal exit, and we will see how he responds to that challenge.
Jo Swinson, thanks very much for talking to us this morning. Now then, a look at what's coming up on BBC One at 10:30.
Coming up on Sunday Morning Live, the government is investing in robots to care for the elderly. Is this the future?
Also, Lem Sissay tells us how, after a childhood in care, poetry changed his life.
And I arrange a special surprise for the veterans at the Poppy Factory.
Join us at 10:30.
Meanwhile, Labour's attitude to an imminent election has drawn comparisons with Vicky Pollard. Yeah, but no, but yeah, but no, but yeah. What are they actually going to do this week? I'm joined by the Shadow Home Secretary, Diane Abbott. Diane Abbott, welcome. You heard Jo Swinson just now talking about this one-line bill coming in on Tuesday. What is Labour's attitude to it?
Labour's attitude to an election is we are up for an election. We have over 500,000 members and they want an election. I don't think any of us believe that Boris Johnson should be empowered for a minute longer than is necessary. Jo Swinson's bill, we haven't had the chance to discuss it with her or the SNP. We saw it about the same time that you saw it. We'll discuss it with her. What is problematic about the bill is not necessarily the notion of an election on the 9th of December. It's that the bill is calling on the EU to give us an extension. We can't dictate to the EU what length of extension they want to give. We have to hear from them.
So, to be absolutely clear, because the expectation now after the publication of this bill is that the EU will grant an extension until the end of January the 31st. If that happens, and this bill is down on the floor of the House of Commons, there is no reason for Labour not to vote for it. You know, you avoid what you consider crashing out without a deal, because there's a delay until the end of January, and you get the election that you say you want. What's the problem?
There's a big if in that. We need to know what sort of extension the EU is going to give. I mean, it would be a disaster for British industry and the country if we came out of the EU without a deal. For instance, look at security. We've got those awful events in Essex with those 39 migrants who died in the back of a lorry. If we crash out without a deal, we'd have no access to the European arrest warrant, we'd have no access to Europol, we'd have no access to all sorts of important databases. We cannot crash out of the EU without a deal, and Labour will do anything in its power to stop that.
I want to come on to those other subjects in a moment, but just to go back to this, to be absolutely clear, if the EU says the extension lasts until the end of January, does Labour back this bill?
We're waiting to see what the EU says, but make no mistake, Labour Party members, over 500,000 of them, and the Labour Party is up for an election.
If you're up for an election, you should back the bill. There's no getting around it.
No, No, because the danger would be that we come out of the EU without it. And I've said to you, even just looking at security, that would be disastrous.
Yeah, but when you say, you've said again and again, that you will back an election as soon as no deal is taken off the table. What do you mean by taken off? Do you mean forever, or for a few months, or because if it's forever, then there's no chance of an election for a long time anyway.
We need to know what sort of extension the EU is granting, because everything turns on that.
But that doesn't take no deal off the table, does it? Because if they grant an extension to the end of January, we could have no deal then. I mean, the two things are different, aren't they?
They are different, but first and foremost, we've said it over and over again, we need to know what sort of extension the EU is granting. When we know that, we'll consider Boris's proposal.
Sorry, but I'm asking a different question. I'm asking what you mean as a party when you say we will have an election once no deal is taken off the table. To put it another way, what would the Prime Minister have to do to get the Labour Party to support an election?
Well, he could come to Parliament and categorically give Parliament undertaking that he's not going to come out without a deal. But he won't do that, because coming out without a deal is something that people around him, like Dominic Cummings, would want, because then it becomes not just Brexit, but a Trump Brexit, opening up the British economy to American multinationals. But if he were to come to Parliament and unequivocally say that he's not going to crash out without a deal, we'd be satisfied with that.
Because to a lot of people watching, it seems that the Labour Party keeps saying we want an election and then finds a reason not to actually vote for an election. Let me remind you of what your leader said. Jeremy Corbyn said before the so-called Ben Act for the extension. This is what he told the House of Commons.
I repeat what I said last night. Let this bill pass and gain royal assent, then we will back an election so we do not crash out with a no-deal exit from the European Union.
The bill has passed, it has got royal assent, and yet you're not calling for an election.
As I said to you, we can't take the risk of having an election and then, because Parliament isn't sitting in the period of that election, we crash out on the 31st.
So we could be in a very, very difficult and strange position here, which is the EU is waiting to determine the length of the extension by looking at what Parliament's going to do, and Parliament is looking at the EU, waiting to what the EU is going to do. And between the two, nothing happens, which is why the people are getting really, really frustrated with this.
Yeah, but that's how the media is presenting it. It is reasonable for Parliament to wait for the EU to make a decision about the extension.
I mean, I was quoting Jeremy Corbyn, which is perhaps unfair. Let me quote somebody else. Let me quote Diane Abbott. At the time of the Tory leadership election, you said that all of these people, whoever becomes leader of the Conservative Party, won't have a majority, they won't be able to deliver Brexit. You're quite right about all of that, and therefore we need a general election. Those things have transpired, and yet we're still not getting a general election.
Because of the threat of no deal, the threat to security, apart from the threat to business and industry. And we wouldn't be a serious national party if we didn't take those threats seriously.
But how do you get rid of this? I mean, this is the problem. How do you get rid of the threat of no deal? The only way to do it is either to pass a deal, and the only deal on offer is Boris Johnson's deal, or else, I suppose, to revoke Article 50. And yet neither of those things are proposed.
Well, one way of doing it would be for Boris Johnson to come to the floor of the House and give the House of Commons a commitment that whatever happens, he will not take Britain out of the EU without a deal.
So if he came to the House of Commons tomorrow and said, assuming that we've got an extension until the 31st of January and an election, I can absolutely promise I don't try and crash out before that. You would vote for that,
If
Liberal?
he said clearly and unequivocally that I will not take Britain out of the EU without a deal, I think not just the Labour Party would be satisfied, a lot of Labour MPs, a lot of Conservative MPs would be satisfied. Let's wait to see if he does that.
All right, let's ask about one of the other big stories, the terrible story of the week, of the 39 people who were killed in that lorry. If you were Labour Home Secretary in a Labour government, what would you do to ensure that kind of thing was much less likely to happen in the future?
There's a number of things you'd have to do. First of all, I think one of the things we're seeing is that these smaller East Coast ports are more vulnerable than Dover, for instance, which has a lot of very serious safeguards. So one of the things you would do is look at security in those smaller ports.
So invest in thermal imaging and so on.
Thermal imaging, more border guards, but we need to look at the security in these East Coast ports because that's clearly a problem. The other thing we would do is we need to have a lot more international cooperation. One of the concerns about crashing out of the EU without a deal is we lose, as I said, access to European arrest warrants, we lose access to important databases, we lose access to Europol. So we have to look, if we are out of the EU by that time, which we can't at this point say, we have to look at better EU-wide cooperation and better international cooperation altogether. You cannot stop international people trafficking gangs if people trafficking is what this is. You can't stop them without working internationally. Yes, we can try and make our East Coast ports more secure, but you have to have more international cooperation, and that's not what the Tories are talking about at this time.
So more border controls is what many people might have not expected the Labour Party to be talking about.
Better border controls. What you want is security at the smaller borders, which is the same as the security you have at Dover.
And to be absolutely clear, this allows people to see inside lorries to work out whether there are illegal immigrants inside lorries who may be in appalling circumstances and open them.
Well, it may not be practical to look inside every lorry, but you do have to step up, it seems to me at this point, the level of security at these small ports.
You've always said that you wanted safe and legal routes for legitimate migrants coming into the UK. Do you distinguish in that between people who are fleeing from war or famine or being persecuted because of their sexuality or religion on the one hand, and people who simply want a better life, who are coming from poorer countries, who want to do better in these countries? Do you discriminate between those groups?
It's not for us to discriminate between those groups.
So you don't?
You know. Well, you know why we had the Windrush scandal? You know why all of those elderly West Indians went through a horrible time, some of them being refused medical treatment, some of them dying before their case could be resolved? It's this type of debate around migration. We have to look at what is fair, we have to look at what is right. We do have to look at improving safe and legal routes. But the longer the media and some politicians talk about migration in this way, the more at risk we are of another Windrush scandal. If you look at the EU 3 million in this country, that's a Windrush scandal waiting to happen.
And when we talk about a safe and legal route, people being able to come in so they're not stuffed inside the back of refrigerated lorries, how does that actually happen? How do you make that happen? Do you, for instance, move the border from Calais to Dover so people can be processed and investigated here?
I think what you have to do is lose the assumption that immigrants are a threat and migrants are always a problem. You have to get the information from people who are seeking to come here. It's a different type of process, it's a different type of attitude, but it's making it easier for people to come where they may have a legal claim to come because they've got family here. It's about safe and legal routes, and it's not about having...
If it's making it easier for people to come, some people will look at, for instance, the ONS figures this week, talking about the population of the UK going up by more than 3 million by 2028. That's 3 Birminghams growing up in this country, and the pressure that will put on public services. Do you worry about this country simply becoming literally overcrowded, or do you think that's ridiculous?
This is exactly the type of debate which led to the Windrush scandal. You are more likely to be helped by a nurse or a doctor from a migrant background than be behind them in the queue. Let's look at what this country's needs are. Let's look at how we can have a more efficient immigration system. Yes. But above all... but just let me finish. Let's look at how we can have an immigration system which reflects these people's which reflects this country's values.
You talk very rightly about people working inside the NHS and bringing economic value to the country. The problem with that is that your conference motion on all of this said very clearly that the Labour Party would reject any immigration system based on incomes, migrants' utility to business and numbers of caps or targets. That suggests that, what people can bring to this country is not going to be part of your thinking at all.
No, I mean, I've made a series of speeches on immigration policy, and we've made it clear that, first of all, we want to stand up for family rights, we want to stand up for human rights, and yes, of course, we need to look at the contribution that migrants currently make to the health service and to social care, and not constantly try and stigmatise them.
Diane Abbott, a big week ahead. Thanks very much indeed for talking to us. Now, apart from being one of the most successful singer-songwriters in the past 15 years, 200 million album sales to date, James Blunt is also a fearless and very funny presence on social media. He takes on trolls with humour and chutzpah. His fans will be glad to know that he's got a new album out that revisits themes from his mammoth hit, You're Beautiful. He will be playing live at the end of the show, and I spoke to him a little earlier to discuss music, fame and Twitter takedowns. First, though, he told me why this album is, for him, back to basics.
Well, I suppose my first album, Back to Bedlam, I just wrote on my own, not expecting there to be an audience, and then it exploded around the world. And I suppose from then on, I never wrote in the same way because I realised people would dissect it and, you know, look into my private life in a way that I was uncomfortable with. But some things have gone on recently that I've really needed to write about. My father's not very well, and at the same time I've got a new little family. I see the circle of life playing out in front of me. I leave them behind for extended periods of time. And so really the audience haven't been in the room while I've been writing the album. It's been really very much for the people I've left behind at home.
So more emotional and fewer musicians sitting in the room with you while you're writing?
Yeah, I mean very much the ideas behind it are just honest and very true and without filter, and I really expose what's going on, which I suppose is why, you know, we do music in the first place.
Yes. And tell us a little bit about the song that you're going to play for us at the end of the show.
I'm going to sing you a song called Cold. It's the first single. The video is a continuation of the You're Beautiful video from 14 years ago when I threw myself off the cliff. This time I make my way back to shore and find the very same clothes. And it's a message to my wife that I may leave her behind whilst I'm away on tour. It talks about the ocean between us, but it says, without you, I'm just cold.
Very, very sweet. Now, you're almost as well known, I have to say, these days for Twitter as you are for music. Lots of people in public life have a horrible time on Twitter. Politicians and journalists and musicians and actors and so forth. You appear to have found a way of enjoying it. Let's just look at a couple of your responses to tweets. Somebody called Dear Jostin says, James Blunt had his 15 minutes of fame and disappeared. And you reply, even less than that. The song was only 3 minutes and 30 seconds long.
And I'm telling the truth.
But you clearly sit there. It's like whack-a-mole. You see the trolls coming up and you spend time sitting there whacking them back.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the thing I'm saddest about is that we genuinely are very nasty to each other online, and the real world, people seem to be much more friendly, and face-to-face dialogue, we seem to be at least respectful in that. Exactly. And yet online we force our opinions as if it's fact. So I'm just laughing at myself for even taking it seriously. If you can't laugh at yourself, you know, what's the point?
Now, you are famously a friend of Harry and Meghan, who've had a terrible time on Twitter, social media generally, and are struggling with that. What's your advice to them?
I suppose keep smiling, because that winds people out more.
James Blunt there with some hard-run advice. So the government, indeed the Prime Minister, promised us that we would leave the EU on Thursday. When he made that promise, he knew his leeway for a deal and he knew the Commons' numbers. So if it's going to be broken, then presumably we'll be hearing expressions of fulsome embarrassment and some pretty abject apologies from ministers. The chairman of the Conservative Party, James Cleverly, who will be running their election campaign as and when it begins, is with me now. And before we come to the apologies, James Cleverly, can I ask you first of all about the Conservative attitude to this bill, which gives you what you say you want, which is an election in December?
No, what this bill, the Lib Dem SNP bill, is clearly a gimmick. Their bill moves the election date by 3 days, yes, takes the withdrawal agreement completely off the table. And if really they want to vote for an election, they can vote for the bill that we put forward. And I think Jo gave the game away. On our terms
or nobody else's
terms?
No,
I think Jo Swinson gave the game away. When you asked her directly, is this bill amendable? And she said, yes, and then she went on to say how she was passionate about votes at 16 and all these other things that will be hung on to that bill.
She didn't want it to be amended. She said she didn't want amendments.
She also said in the past she was going to respect the referendum result, didn't. Her party was the first to call for an in-out referendum. Now they're calling to revoke. So, if you'll excuse me, I'm a little bit cynical about some of the promises we get from the opposition benches.
But it just seems to me that this is a bill, it's a one-line bill more or less, very, very short, coming in on Tuesday, and it says to the Conservative Party, you keep saying you want an election, you keep telling us you want an election, you can have an election, all that's required is for the EU to give us the extension they say they're going to give us anyway, to the end of January the 31st. There's no more ifs nor buts. At some point, you've got to take yes for an answer.
We've not been the ones that have called for a general election 35 times. It's the leader of the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn.
You're calling for it now.
And the point that we've made is the sequencing and timing that we've put forward will see us delivering Brexit with a deal, which is what many people claimed was completely impossible, and also has a general election so that we can get a sustainable working majority to deliver on the priorities the British people tell us about.
Day after day after day, the Prime Minister has said, give me the election, go on, give me the election, give me an election, find me a way to have an election. Two parties say, here's a way to have an election, and you suddenly say, oh, no, thanks.
No, because the point is they are saying, let's no longer make any attempt to get the withdrawal agreement through. The SNP, and the SNP, Andrew, the SNP...
You haven't got time to do that on your timing either.
So hang on, which way is it? Either simple bills, which don't need to be amended, can be shot through the House in a few hours in some instances, or they're not. And we are saying this withdrawal agreement bill, which codifies the agreement that's been made with the EU and capitals around Europe, can go through. People have been discussing this for years, over 500 hours worth of debate. The SNP and the Lib Dems want to scrap Brexit. They're clear about that.
So you're going to bring back the withdrawal agreement bill next week?
Well, the Prime Minister has already laid out a timetable whereby we get the withdrawal agreement bill through so we can leave with a deal like we said we wanted to, like we've always said we wanted to, and also gives the British people the election that I think they recognise that Parliament needs, because the current parliamentary maths stifles everything and prevents us from delivering the priorities of the British people, like schools.
So you're going to bring back the bill next week?
Well, the Prime Minister has already laid out a timetable, and if
you want
parliamentarians,
the bill through, bring it back. I mean, surely.
And if parliamentarians are as good as their word and say they respect the referendum result and they want us to leave with a deal and then a general election, our proposal deals that.
So you will never be taken seriously as a party accusing other parties of being frightened of an election if you're given the opportunity to vote for election and you choose not to. That will completely blow out the strategy of saying,
Andrew,
they're free. If you don't vote for an election, you can't complain.
We've put forward the proposals for an election. The Lib Dems and the SNP are seeking, in their bill, they're seeking to change the date by 3 days.
So
take the withdrawal, but more importantly,
so what? What's the significance of 3 days?
And make no attempt to even pursue the withdrawal agreement bill. We have been clear. We want to leave the European Union in good order. That's what we've always said, and we want a general election. Ours does both. Theirs does not do both.
Yet, if you're really confident about winning a general election, what you have to do is change the parliamentary numbers and get the majority you need to do what you want to do. And the only way to do that is an election. And now you're being offered that election and you're saying, no.
No.
Makes no
Andrew,
sense.
You keep dancing around the circle. We put forward proposals for a general election first, but also the delivery of Brexit. And what we're not going to do is we're not going to listen to two parties who have explicitly said they want to stop Brexit from happening.
Okay.
We're not going to be complicit in them stopping Brexit from happening.
Well, let's come on to you don't trust them and they don't trust you for some very good reasons.
Well, there's a difference. The reason I don't trust them is Jo said that she would respect the referendum result. Now she's saying she's going to revoke Article 50.
Well, let's talk about your side. Your government said that you were going to prorogue Parliament. You needed to prorogue Parliament for 5 weeks in order to get your Queen's Speech bill. You were told you couldn't do that. It was illegal by the Supreme Court, and you managed to get the Queen's Speech through in a matter of days. That was a complete nonsense, that proroguing argument. You said you wouldn't ask for a Brexit delay. There was a clever way around the Benn bill, we kept being told, the Benn Act, we kept being told, and then in the end, you sent the letter anyway. Again, we couldn't trust what you were saying. We were told that you were
You're
saying...
getting your facts wrong, Andrew.
No, which facts were wrong in that?
So the point is, we always said we would abide by the law.
But there's a way around it, you said, as a government.
Yes, the Parliament passed a bill, Parliament sent the letter. The Prime Minister made it absolutely clear we did not want an extension. We thought the extension was counterproductive. And actually, being firm about that 31st of October date, which, remember, is a date put forward by the European Union, not the UK, by being firm on that date, we actually got the pragmatism and the flexibility from the EU, which let us get a deal done. So that deadline helped us get a deal. And absolutely, we completely stand by our focus on that date. And it was the House of Commons, the House of Parliament, that prevented us actually delivering what we promised.
Well, I was saying you did send the letter. You said you wouldn't, and you did. You also said you'd bring forward a budget in November. When is the budget going to happen?
Well, what we've seen is that because we don't have parliamentary numbers, we are not going to get these votes through. You need a majority.
So no budget
You need
either.
a majority to deliver on a governmental agenda, and we're giving the British people the opportunity to choose. Do they want to give us a sustainable working majority, or do they want to continue with this uncertainty, with this delay, with the indecision that we're seeing from the current parliamentary numbers?
Well, if you want to know the answer to that, vote for this thing on Tuesday. It's very straightforward.
Well, why don't they vote for the proposal that we put forward?
Well, this is a Me Tooism. After you, Claude, it's a bit ridiculous, isn't it? What about, you said at the beginning of this week that because of the Letwin amendments and so forth, the government would go on strike if that happened. And then you immediately reversed that.
No,
well, that's what Number 10 was saying.
The government is still making sure that we are providing a good service to the British people. We've seen recently our announcement about the cystic fibrosis drugs, life-changing drugs. We are doing what we can do within the confines we've got, but ultimately, governments need to legislate, and until we get that sustainable working majority, we cannot credibly legislate. And that's why we're saying to all parties in the House, let's get Brexit done, and let's resolve the impasse that the current parliamentary numbers impose upon all of us.
Let's talk about one of the things you might be legislating about. I was talking last week to Dominic Raab about the level playing field arrangements, workers' rights, regulations of all kinds, and whether you wanted to go down or go up when it comes to that. He said, no, we want stronger rights, we want better,
we've been clear on
better
that.
protection.
We've been clear on that.
So can you explain to us what happened with the leak to the Financial Times this week of an internal government paper which made it clear that you want to loosen those regulations, that is the plan?
No, again, you're getting your facts wrong, Andrew.
Let me read. Okay, let me
divergent.
Diverge. Let me read. From the document, the UK and the EU's interpretation of these commitments will be very different, and they will represent a much more open starting point for future negotiations. Now, what does that mean if it doesn't mean that you want to change them?
Well, hang on. So change and lessen are not interchangeable words.
No, they're not. But
so the point is, we've already, in many areas, we've already gone further than the EU. You saw in the Queen's speech that we are making hard commitments on improving workers' rights. We've driven through an increase in the national living wage. We're increasing the starting salaries for some of the lowest paid workers in the country. We're increasing maritime protections. We're increasing animal welfare. We're looking to prevent the transportation of live animals to slaughter. We are going further than the EU demands, and divergence doesn't mean lessening. And you suggesting that these are interchangeable terms is fundamentally wrong.
The lawyers say that the words that you put in, the changes in the words, must mean a loosening of the standards of some kind.
No. I've just given you examples where we're going further.
Well, let's not go back to the examples. Let me ask you about one other thing.
But it matters. It really matters because
you're in charge of this election.
If we're saying that we don't trust the British people to vote for governments that will enhance workers' rights and enhance environmental protections and enhance animal welfare, then we are saying something really quite negative about the British people, and I don't subscribe to that.
All right, there's been reports overnight, they're still coming in, about whether or not the Americans have killed al-Baghdadi, the former leader of ISIS. What's your reaction? First of all, what do you know about that? And second, if it's true, what's your reaction?
Well, I don't know for certain what the situation is, and I would feel very uncomfortable speculating about such a sensitive issue. What we do know is that the President has said he's making a statement at 1300 hours GMT. I think we should wait for that, see what has actually happened, and then make any commentary after that, because I think speculating about what might be an ongoing operational security issue, I think, would be inappropriate.
You are the last government minister I'm going to be able to speak to before Thursday. Are we going to leave the EU on Thursday, yes or no?
Well, unless and until we get an extension from the EU, that remains our exit date, which is why we ramped up the no-deal preparations.
The real answer is no, though, isn't it?
Well, until we get an extension, then the real answer is yes. And the real frustration for me is that we put forward a deal which would have seen us leave on time with an agreement, and Labour, the Lib Dems and the SNP voted against it. James Cleverly, Tory Party Chairman, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. Now then, thanks to all my guests this week. As promised, we will now leave you with some live music from James Blunt. His new album's called Once Upon a Mind, and from it, this is Cold. Until next week, goodbye.
It's been lonely, trying to get your attention from 1,000 miles away. And you know me, always overthinking the worst possibilities. Yeah, we both know, in between you and me, there's an ocean. cast away in a sea and it's frozen. I'm exposed, can't you see? All I need is a little warmth. Without your arms around me, without you on my skin, without you on my body, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. I don't mean to be desperate or pretend that I'm not torn, but I don't want to let go of the things that keep me warm. Without you, I'm just cold. I built a little boat with a sail from the memories I've been collecting. And I'll hold out for the winter below me, take me home the whole way in your direction. Yeah, we both know in between you and me there's an ocean, and I'm just trying to get a little closer. Pull me in, 'cause I'm here, and all I need is a little warmth. Without your arms around me, without you on my skin, without you on my body, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. I don't mean to be desperate or pretend that I'm not torn, but I don't want to let go of the things that keep me warm. Without you, I'm just cold. And I need a little fire, and you're my gasoline. So light me up, I'm burning with all these things I feel, and I'll always hold this flame for you, but it's naked on the breeze. So let me in, don't lock me out, don't cast me out to sea. Your arms around me, without you on my skin, without you on my body, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. I don't mean to be desperate or pretend that I'm not torn, but I don't want to let go of the things that keep me warm. Without you, I'm just cold. Without you, I'm just cold.
Brilliant, thank you. Fantastic.